The following content is provided under a Creative Commons license. Your support will help MIT OpenCourseware continue to offer high-quality educational resources for free. To make a donation or to view additional materials from hundreds of MIT courses, visit MIT OpenCourseware at ocw.mit.edu.
Hello, welcome to the Center for Advanced Visual Studies. My name is Joe Zane. I'm the Artistic Production Coordinator here at the Center. It's great to see so many new faces in the audience tonight. For those of you who don't know, let me tell you a little bit about the Center. The Center was founded in 1967, where it began its life as a fellowship program for artists. Since then, it has acted as a laboratory for artistic research and experimentation. In 2004, Larissa Harris joined as Associate Director. She brought myself and Curatorial Associate Meg Rawton on board. Together, we have set up a structure of local resident artists, student resident artists, a visiting artist series, workshops, and some ambitious long-term projects. I encourage you all to join our mailing list to stay in touch about upcoming events and projects. Okay, on to the puppetry. I'm going to run through some bios quickly so that we can get on with it. We have three terrific guests. First off, we have puppeteer Karen Zasloff. Karen is an artist, puppeteer, and educator. For the past 10 years, he has designed, built, and performed original shows in museums, theaters, and public spaces in New York, Massachusetts, and Vermont. She has taught English, art, and drama in New York City public schools and community centers. Tonight, Karen is going to introduce her work and then treat us to a 15-minute shadow puppet performance. She will be followed by Linda Norden. Linda is a curator and writer in contemporary art. She was responsible, along with art form senior editor Scott Rothkopf, for the production of Pierre Week's 2004 puppet opera, This Is Not a Time for Dreaming. Tonight, Linda is going to give us a behind-the-scenes view of that production, as well as show us some material regarding the making of a puppet of herself that was used in that production. Finally, we will have a talk by John Bell. John started performing as a puppeteer at Bread and Puppet Theater when he learned about the global breadth of puppetry. After earning his PhD in theater history at Columbia, he began teaching at the college level and is presently assistant professor of performing arts at Emerson College. I want to thank all of our guests and you for coming to this event, and I hope to see you at many more future events. Thank you. Let's get started.
Within the window's branching tapestry, leaves tremble, and inside upon the sill the gray cat sits, tail twitching, ears athrill. With springtime singing greenly through the screen, her yellow eyes fix outward to the tree. Her claws, drawn inward, hesitate until a sparrow hops from tree to window sill, then forelegs mime a silent savagery. I drag a string across the floor inside. You swoop with grace, but not the fierce intent your trance-like dance upon the sill implied. Which world for you is true experience? The playful indoor comfort I provide, or murderous outdoor hunt your gaze invents?
Picture men living in a cavernous chamber underground. They have been here from childhood, chained by the leg and by the neck so that they cannot move and can see only what is in front of them. A bright fire is burning behind them. In front of that fire are people carrying various artificial objects, including figures of men and animals in wood or stone, which cast shadows for the chained men to see, as though they were watching a puppet show. These shadows are the only reality these prisoners have ever known. What if one of the prisoners were set free and forced to stand up and turn around? At first he would be unable to even make out the objects that were the origins of the shadows. And if he were forced to look at the firelight itself, his eyes would ache and he would try to escape and turn back to the shadows, the things his eyes were accustomed to. And suppose someone were to drag him away forcibly up the steep and rugged ascent and not let him go until he had hauled him out into the sunlight. Would he not suffer pain and vexation at such treatment? And when he had come out into the light, find his eyes so full of radiance that he could not see a single thing? He would need to grow accustomed before he could see things in that upper world. At first, it would be easiest to make out shadows, and then the images of men and things reflected in water, and later, the things themselves. After that, it would be easier to watch the heavenly bodies and the sky itself by night, looking at the light of the moon and stars rather than the sun and the sun's light in the daytime. Last of all, he would be able to look at the sun and contemplate its nature, not as it appears when reflected in water.
truck's foul breath, the burn of hot concrete, the roar of cars, the siren's piercing scream, the stamp of footsteps crowding down the street. Is this what you envision when you dream? Outside, you'd crouch in alleys, under cars, with eyes and ears attuned, awake and aware. Then taste your first hot bird's blood in your jaws, and slowly grow accustomed to the glare. Inside, I sit on sofa, you on still. I read, you watch a shadow world of birds, in both my book and your imagined kill. We feel the real in mind, in dreams, in words. Though Plato says this life we feel is lies, is not the real in what we visualize?
Getting to see you and the expression and the relationship between your room and the screen. Just the triangle of it all. But the question is, looking at the images and hearing the music you played out, it feels almost like a series of gestures. I'm wondering, sorry, a series of gestures. And I mean that a lot of it.
Well, we were interested in, can you just first say, since we did this without any introduction, this is a show that my sister and I developed together. Her name is Beth Zasloff, I'm Karen, and she wrote the text, the sonnets, and those in the middle were excerpts from Plato's Allegory of the Cave. And she developed this text from watching her cat look out the window at the birds and be very ferocious, and sort of thinking about the fact that this cat has grown up inside all of her life, and she sees what seems to be kind of a natural reality for her, and mimics the kind of actions of the cat in nature, but yet when she would go out, when she was ever taken out into the world, Lucille, the cat, was very frightened. So Beth thought of Plato's Allegory of the Cave in reference to this, and then we extended that to sort of thinking about the role of the artist and how the relationship to reality, and also in terms of shadows, what you can learn from shadows. Is it just a question of kind of leaving shadows behind as you become enlightened and can look directly at the sun, or can we or the artist stay in the world of shadows and find something there too? So in terms of your question about gesture, movement, I think that we're very interested in moving the cardboard, the silhouettes with music only so that the text can be heard on its own, so these aren't talking pieces of cardboard, but so that the images themselves tell a story and the text tells a story, and then it's possible to think about those in relationship. So I don't know if that
Yeah, no,
is
that's
the gesture.
I was just, it doesn't, so,
Could you, are those made on transparencies?
Yes, they're just overhead projection transparencies, sometimes with, yes, actually they're just pieces of cardboard attached with wire and then manipulated with wires, moved across transparency. Sometimes it's necessary, you probably saw a little flash of light, sometimes it's necessary to put just a blank transparency over top so that you can move something very fragile smoothly over the top of a bunch of things stacked up. So yes, transparency is cardboard wire. And this is a show that Beth and I did in 2001 for a venue which was Shoshama Windows on 42nd Street. So it was inside a shop window, a building in transition. We were sitting inside the window projecting on vellum, which was against the window, and it was for passers-by. And some of the images that you saw in the show, like the building and in the city scene, was across the street from the windows, and that was also the idea of so much focus on windows and in this image.
Just as a comment, I found it very interesting that you don't have the apparatus living it up, it's all visible, and it doesn't disturb at all your imagination. It is such a empowerment of the audience, you can see it all, and you don't get disturbed. You know, it's not like you want to have it hide. So it's really amazing how that is possible. It's
That is fun for people to see all the scrappy little pieces of paper down there.
and just the transposition, you know, the change, in such a low-tech thing, but it's so sophisticated, you know, just that we getting to see that.
It might be, unless there's other questions. All right, thanks very much.
Weirdly hard act to follow in that I was so moved by the sort of ratio of action to effect and how low-tech that was. And what I'm about to show you is something that, can you hear me? Is this loud enough? Okay. What I'm about to sort of describe is a project that was very opposite to that. It's for better and for worse, and that's something I hope we'll discuss. Incredibly high production, even though the quality of attention at every point, I think, was intense and real. So this is a project by the artist Pierre Huyghe, a French artist born in the 60s, who was invited to do a project at Harvard. Huyghe is, at the time that invitation was extended, which was about 2000, I think the year 2000. It was really because a funding organization, Étant Donné, made money available to work with a French artist, and two people, a student at the time named Scott Rothkopf and I, both were interested in working with Huyghe, who was not that well known in the States at the time. All this has changed. Anyway, what I'm here, what I wanted to talk about today is the way the project began and the point of where the puppets came in. Because this is a project that began through a series of conversations. First, myself and Pierre meeting, I'd never met him, in a cafe that he designed in Paris, an over-the-top kind of set of signifiers as a social arena, a very highly overdetermined environment. And we talked about the only piece of information I had to work with, which was that Pierre was interested in this building, the Carpenter Center, which is Corbusier's only building in North America. And it was finished posthumously right after Corbusier died in 64. It was begun in 61. It was proposed in 59 by people who were really interested in Corbusier in the architecture department, José Luis Serre. And Pierre was interested in two things, so he said. Just if we can contest the genesis of an idea, but this is what got said. The building and the fact that it was a multi-purpose kind of center, a student center and a center for the arts. It's not really a student center, but it is a center for the arts. And those of you who don't know, Harvard is one of the only universities in the country that's on paper against the idea of graduate study or the study or engagement of creative art making in the university context. So there is no graduate program in any of the arts except the School of Design, not theater, writing, music, art. And this building, when it came up, was quite controversial, both in the community as a structure, but also in the university as a center in which the practice of art would be taught. And as a result, it's called the Center for Visual and Environmental Studies. It's not called the art department. And because they could rationalize design and design training and the structuring of design training in a way that they weren't willing to rationalize studio practice. So Pierre was familiar with some of that history, was interested in the building, as a kind of pastiche of a lot of different innovations of Corbusier's that had come up in response to particular sites and problems. And more than that, was interested in the idea of the practice of art within the context of an institution, and specifically a university. So the two things were this building, its history, its commission, and its genesis, and the nature of the dialogue between the architect and the university. And he sort of ruminated over those ingredients and kept us on hold for about 3 years. And we had conversations all the way through. And it crystallized the summer of 2003 through pressure from us and pressure from his own schedule or whatever he was ready. But for between 2002 and 2003, because we had to write grants, we came up with an idea for the project that sort of was formulated as far as he'd gotten his thinking. And it was going to be 3 parts. It was going to be an architectural extension correction that would go in this space that was meant to be a very rough-hewn, simple, low cost, low budget structure. He was inspired by Ricret Tervigne, his friend, wanted it to be plywood, and it was also based on the idea of Corbusier's, the center in Paris that Corbusier had done, the Pavillon des Temps Nouveaux, which was a center that Corbusier designed at the behest of the cultural commissioner in Paris, Malraux, as a student hangout. This is a lot of information, but it's important because it's all crystallized in the puppets, in a sense. And so what interested Pierre in that building of Corbusier's is that it was designed specifically as a hangout, as a place for students to get kids off the street. And it failed in that everything that was programmed into it, nobody was interested in. But it succeeded beyond anybody's anticipation as a hangout. What the kids did is they hung out with each other, and they smoked and they talked, and they mostly hung out outside the building. And so Pierre wanted to do the same. He imagined, having visited this building several times, that what happened inside the building that was structured and programmed was less interesting than how and where students congregated elsewhere. He was just interested in that relationship, the difference between them. And so he wanted to create this kind of hangout space under the building, which we kind of disabused him of the notion that it would be in Boston in the winter, a fun place to hang out. But that was part one. There was going to be this architectural component. Then secondly, Corbusier planned an not an elaborate, but a very specific landscape program for the building that never got done.
He was angry that it got cited off the yard, that modern architecture, to the extent it was even allowed at Harvard, was, was marginalized and exiled, and it was on the periphery of the yard. And so he decided that what he wanted by way of landscaping was what he called "what the birds bring." And that's a kind of apocryphal anecdote, but it's actually a true anecdote. It became apocryphal because it got exaggerated. But it was the idea that weeds and grasses from the yard would be brought by birds who deposited seeds, and you would let those things grow. You would create a medium in which they could grow. So you would have dirt on this level and dirt on the roof, and you would essentially encourage the cultivation of whatever got brought in. And that never got developed for various reasons. And then the third thing would be to make a movie, because that has come to be, and he was very ambivalent about this, he didn't want to be locked into making a movie, but that had come to be an idiom or a medium that he felt he could capture and hold on to and reframe whatever he did in the course of developing a project. So what we proposed when we wrote our grants was this three-stage thing, and it was all built on this continual going backwards to sort of probe how a story is told, usually through going, quote unquote, into the archive, seeing how is the story told of the building, let's say. And then finding the fissures, finding the disconnects between the way the story is told and the way things seem to have transpired. And then proposing a retelling of the story that seizes on that disconnect or that fissure. Then enacting the story in some way, and then retelling it through film usually. And part of the enactment, at the end of the sort of enactment, he usually tries to do something that involves a public and a community, which often becomes a spectacle. Just because he thinks when there's a lot of fanfare and something is really special, and he tries to draw on events that have had success in a local place, you attract a lot of people, you attract interest, and he wants audience. So that's where the project stayed for several years, and even in fairly articulate form between 2002 and 2003. And then in the fall of 2003, we wrote this up for grants. And then between 2003 and 2004, it was supposed to open in September 2004, we were still kind of on hold, but what changed is that Pierre, that's Corbusier, and this book, which was written by somebody named William Curtis and Edward Seckler, who had been at the Graduate School of Design, and students, Seckler was a professor, Curtis was a student, at the time that José Luis Sert was there and had invited Corbusier to come on. So they were all involved in trying to get Harvard to hire Corbusier for the commission and to encourage this commission. And then after, once the building started, Curtis, who did photography, meticulously documented the whole procedure, all of the stages of design, all of the stages of building, and changes in the design. And Pierre, we gave Pierre this book. We also showed him, it took him to the archive, and he plowed through the archive to some extent. He doesn't have the patience of a scholar. He knows certain things capture his imagination. In particular, this template for one of the plants, just 2 pieces of gray paper. But what the book functioned as, or what it sort of intersected in his creative thinking, was the idea of storyboard, which is a very seminal aspect of his creative process. It's the organization of a story into a sequence of images, and that's the way his films get made. And it's kind of a central sort of trope in his creative thinking. And the book sort of triggered that. And suddenly he felt like he knew what he was doing. And he came back to the idea of doing a film. No puppets still. This is the fall of 2003. And we have 8 months to produce this. And it's supposed to happen early in the summer. It gets postponed. We meet finally, after he's finished another project, we meet, or several other projects, in July, the 5th of July, I will remember, of 2004, for a project that has been pushed to the latest possible date, which is November 18th, which is when it actually opened. So July 5th, he tells us he wants to use puppets. He's figured it out. And the reason for puppets is that he thinks he wants to explore a certain kind of, he wants to explore as many aspects of the metaphor as he can. He wants the symbolism, he wants the idea of the artist as puppet, and he had a particular thing in mind. He wanted to out the players, in a sense, and he wanted to create an allegory and turn the story into a kind of parable. So there's a conceit here, and he was very anxious about it, but the conceit was that it was autobiographical, and he'd never done anything that was about himself and his own process, which he attributed in part to the educational environment, in part to where he was in his career, in part to just an identification with having read a lot of Corbusier's correspondence with the university, his sense of the trauma that Corbusier and anger that Corbusier communicated over the intractability of the university to, in their negotiations around creative ideas. And he felt that the university would then become a kind of analog for all of the institutions within which he had to work. And what this parable was going to be about was the dialogue between an idea, a creative idea, and an institution that's sponsoring the idea. And the characters were going to be Corbusier, Seckler, and Sert, the architect, the on-site architect. And so Seckler would be the professor, the advocating professor and the recorder. Sert would be the on-site architect. Corbusier would be the idea, the creative architect. And then it was going to be Pierre, and he told us curators we were going to be, personified in this film, which was a little traumatic. And it came about because he looked over his shoulder as he was walking around the building, the Carpenter Center, with Seckler, who was still alive, and he said that he saw the curators kind of tiptoeing behind. That's me, watching, wondering what he was thinking. So to get to the puppet part, that's the site of what was going to then be not just an extension, correction, or a structure that students could sort of hang out in, but a theater now, a theater for a puppet performance, which would get filmed. And on the night of the opening event, you would see the live puppet performance. You would go through what was supposed to be the entrance to the building. It's a whole other story about zoning changes and the building getting sunk because it was too high. So Pierre wanted to resurrect the original entrance of the building, and you'd go from the theater through a pivot door, which was meant to be the entrance, into the lobby, and down to the theater, which is one flight down in the Corbusier building, where you would see the same performance on film. Things changed a little bit. You saw sections of the performance in the puppet theater, and then you saw the film. And you couldn't, because of the chair of the department, we weren't allowed to use that door. But so things didn't get realized perfectly, but that was the concept. And what then happened is, in very short order, I had to become familiar, to the best extent I could, with people working in puppetry who made puppets, because Pierre had a very, very particular idea of what he wanted the puppets to look like. And it's one of those things where when an artist has things fabricated, there are many, many degrees of involvement. Some artists have a very rough idea and are happy to have somebody execute something and then respond to it after. For Pierre, the process and the craft, whatever the medium that he's using, whatever technique he's using, is integral to the concept. So a piece that he did that you might have seen called A Million Kingdoms, which involved a very high-end synthesizer, very sort of sophisticated synthesizer, was done because it was about a conflation of Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth and the moon, Neil Armstrong's landing on the moon, and so he wanted an effect that would kind of amplify the sense of strangeness of that narrative, that mythical narrative, and the actual arrival on the moon. So in this case, the puppets, getting the right kind of puppet and thinking about the puppet and then the props was really, really central to the effect and the impact of the film. Pierre doesn't draw very well, so everybody had to wait he doesn't draw easily. Everyone had to wait, and these are not his drawings. But what transpired is I spent a month sort of going through a list of, actually Julie Tamar's list, because it was the most extensive list, of puppet makers on the East Coast and the West Coast, 2 places, and I limited it to the East Coast just because of time and money. And then I talked to about 50 different people, got recommendations from all kinds of friends. I had earlier involvement with some puppet makers and talked to them, and identified a few people, and then we brought it down to 1, and then there were all kinds of complicated negotiations, but I won't go through the politics. But we ended up with puppet makers who do a lot of the Muppets, and who had never done anything that looked like what Pierre wanted them to do. It was a consortium called Puppet Heap of individual puppet makers in New Jersey. And then I got other people to do props in much the same process. And what these drawings came out of was Pierre going and meeting with the various puppet makers to tell them what he had in mind. And so it was a kind of back and forth between photographs, discussion, description, and his looking at their work to evolve these forms and these figures, which in the end everybody was really kind of happy with. So that's Corbusier. That's a dress that they decided was what a curator would wear. Which is really freaky for me because my grandmother had a dress which I was around, I helped her make in the early 60s that was identical to this in this fabric called Ultra Suede, which was brand new and she thought was like, she got this remnant, so I kind of freaked out. I looked just like my grandmother in this film. This is Seckler, and that's Pierre before his sweater was done. That's me, that's a bird. This is from a sea. I'm never on that rock. Corbusier dies on that rock very melodramatically. This is meant to be Pierre in the archives, and he and another, somebody he works with made all of the props. But anyway, and then this figure was something completely in Pierre's imagination. And he got one of the puppet makers to do this, and it was something that they really, really enjoyed as a collaboration. It became a collaboration between them. And that same puppet maker, Bill, I'm going to have to tell you his name in a minute, or I should because he needs credit. But his name is, I'll tell you before this is over. But anyway, he also made, if any of you saw another film by Pierre, the Antarctica film, he made the penguin, the white penguin in that too. And he actually runs, I think, the Muppet Workshop. But this was called Mr. Harvard, Dean of Deans. And this was meant to be the kind of Darth Vader symbolic figure who kind of mediated between, who reigned over the university and represented the university. And for the props, they were really interesting because there's going to be no talking, no narrative in the film, but he wanted to show Corbusier thinking. And so what he arrived at was through kind of conversation, and then he suddenly knew what he wanted. What he arrived at was that the buildings should move, and that the moving should represent a sense of thinking. And he also wanted to show the way in which the design of the building changed. And through the narrative, through the series of scenes that the puppet play ends up taking, you see these negotiations. You see a whole process of kind of conception, dream, worry, confrontation with the dean figure. And then you see it both, you go back and forth between Corbusier and Pierre, and Corbusier with the dean, and then Pierre and me, and all of the different, what he tries to do is to attend to all of the different kind of psycho-relationships that transpire in the process of the commission getting realized. But what he did for the buildings is he wanted to have 3 different things. He wanted each of the parts, and I think I'll have this as a separate image. There, this is where Corbusier dreams. So you have things like the ondulatoire, this kind of moving, these strips where the light changes as it moves around the building, which was done for Champ de Gare. And you have the sort of pivot door, or the pivot door was from Champ de Gare, and the ondulatoire was from one of the Mediterranean buildings. And they all got, as I said, pastiched into this building. And he wanted props made for each of the different parts. And there would be this dance of all of the different sort of signifying details or innovations from earlier buildings that went into this building. And then he wanted the wireframe building, which is this one, he wanted it to function like a puppet. And he wanted it to be built in several parts so that you could raise different parts at different times. And this was all conveyed through him telling me in a phone call what he wanted in great detail, and my communicating it to the prop makers after, secondhand. And then Pierre met with the prop makers, and they were this little workshop in New York that does both pro bono and commercial work. And they're kind of subversive in the pro bono work they do. I don't know if this would count as subversive, but they do things where they can for anybody that they want to support, and then they try to fund it. They do absolute to make their money. Pardon?
Why did he, if he has such a critique of the institution,
yeah.
For example, and working with the institution, why is he working with the institution?
Why is he working in the institution?
Yeah, I mean, the whole piece seems to be a dramatic critique of Harvard as an institution. I mean, he's making the Harvard is sort of like a devil, Darth Vader character.
Right.
So why does he bother working with Harvard and having you all do all this
and
work
lose my job?
and work, you're following around and doing whatever you want, and his whole show is about how you guys suck.
No, if you watch the film, it's not about how everybody sucks. It's about the dynamic. Because I think to be able to tell a story with subtlety and detail has tremendous impact. I hope it does, and I think it does, because the film gets shown, and the way, I mean, I know I sound like I'm mythologizing and I'm getting down at his feet. I think that what I value in this is the realization of the kind of breakdown of a series of relationships and their reenactment in a way that's really powerful. And I believe that it's powerful, and I believe that for all the people who participated in the viewing of this and just thought it was, a great time and a spectacle and that they were cool to be a part of it, there's impact and there's resonance. Yeah.
As a follow-up to that question, I wanted to just, because I'm struck by the fact that you're describing to me how Pierre would talk to you over the phone and then you would give the instructions further.
Yeah.
It seems like almost he was doing this intentionally, because this is...
You mean like it's a power thing?
And
I'm this...
Given practice myself, I would definitely make sure there's some drawings on the table, right?
Yeah.
So is this also like...
Well, there are drawings. I'm exaggerating, but I'm trying to explain something.
But basically, exactly this, that is the process that you're describing also part of the project in that sense that it's implicating the institution and the structures and relationships within the institution through these kind of mediated actions.
Well, I mean, are you saying that my kind of subservient role in this?
Subservient role, but that's not me.
Yeah, no, okay, no, but I mean, I'm not sure. You're saying that you're implicating, that he is implicating the university by using them that way?
Sorry?
Are you saying he's implicating that he's actually exploiting the university in a sense, in the process? Yeah, I think he is. I mean, I'm sure the director of the museum would say, I mean, this project so infuriated. I did lose my job because it was way over budget, and we raised most of the money, and I've never been over budget on things. I take pride in being enterprising, and we were very enterprising on this. In spite of the monies that were spent, there are a million. But what I value in it, because I've gone back and forth, I think it's an incredibly powerful narrative or allegory. And I think what I would want to do now, you want to think about where can it be most effectively played and played out. so that it's not simply something that's permutated at different museum venues and not seen.
And it is about being a puppet. It is about being the executor of someone else's song.
Right.
To translate that, I think he would not easily try to do that to Linda. It's not about them as individuals. It's
right.
much more about a mechanism.
Right.
And I think that's a very true mechanism. And where to criticize it the best, it's
at Harvard.
It's at the location itself.
Exactly, at the location. And I mean, I saw this again in a big, at Bourriel, I mean, his Biennale in Lyon. I mean, it was sort of the relation. And I was struck by how much, how powerful the critique is. I mean, there's a scene in the middle which is so true a reenactment of something that actually happened, where we'd had this meeting. The title, "This is not a time for dreaming," for example, comes from, I'll answer in a second. It comes from an email that was sent to me the night before we had what's called our all-hands meeting, which museums typically have, where everybody involved in the production sits around a table. And I was told, don't bring the artist, because this, in all caps, with a whole row of exclamation points, the deputy director was writing this to me, "This is not a time for dreaming." Meaning, nuts and bolts now, we got to get down to work. We don't want, the charming artist or whatever. And I knew that, that when a staff doesn't see everybody who's involved in a project, it's really sort of alienating. And so I just wanted everybody to be there. But what I'm trying to say is there's this scene right after that meeting. I hadn't told anybody, I did my whole presentation, that the puppeteers just said, fuck this. They just gave up right the day before, and they said they didn't have time to do the work they wanted to do the way they wanted to do it. And I didn't tell anyone because I think they would have just dropped the whole project. So afterwards I told Pierre, and he's going back to New York, he had to go back to New York, and he turned around from getting in the taxi and looked back at me like, and that look he inscribed in the film, in this scene in which the dean of the Darth Vader figure picks me up and drops me. So it's very melodramatic, and it's very, I mean, when I saw that, I thought, oh my God, I can't stand this. And it's, there was a part of me that just, not because I was embarrassed, even if I was, but because I thought, isn't that a cheap, sentimental kind of acting out? But I think it's incredibly powerful, and I think that really the rhetorical question I'm putting out to you, separate from the whole business of how the puppets get made and how they do their work and how effective they are, is about a work that is itself quite powerful, in my opinion, and what it takes to make that kind of work and where it happens and who can support it. Yeah.
Both your role and what kind of a work this was. Was this treated as an exhibition or a performance or both?
Well, I was going to.
And were you the developer and the planner of the exhibition or the performance, if you want to call it?
I can answer that. Actually, I don't want to take too much more time, but I'll just quickly.
Good job conceptualizing what the artist wanted.
Thank you.
It's kind of difficult to take what's in the artist's mind and bring it into fruition to something that everybody else can view.
Well, that's what, I mean, thanks. I think, to the extent, the answer is I was a curator on the staff. I was the producer of this with Scott Rothkopf as another person. He was in New York at the time. He was working in New York. So I was sort of the on-site, and he was a great collaborator, but I was definitely the one that had to do the producing with. It was done as both an exhibition, it was a film, it had to be made as a film, and in addition to the film, I'm not telling the story, but in addition to the film, these are props based on, these are scenes from the film. I also had to find the puppeteers and things. So it's a film that was made that involved commissioning the props, commissioning the puppets, all the other things that go into any kind of film project. And then getting a staff. Pierre had an assistant who did most of the work on getting the film crew together. There are 28 people involved in making this. And I'm saying that not with pride, but just as a statement, you know what I mean? And then it was performed, when the film was finished, there was a performance at Harvard. This is a scene from the shell, the theater, that was the outgrowth of that extension correction to the building, which was done, a whole subtext of this was the idea of an intra-departmental project. So we worked with an architect from the Graduate School of Design, and we got caught in the middle of all of the Harvard balkanizing politics, where you have the museum, the Graduate School of Design, and the art department, which is where the building was the art department, each of which were giving lip service to collaboration, but only wanted it if their name went first, all of those power relationships which got played out. But this structure was the theater, and then it was handmade by a group of students who put together this plexi and bolted it in the freezing cold. So it's a very labor-intensive project that a lot of students worked on, as well as the artist. And then this structure was built, and the night, as I said, the filming took place. And then when the film was done, 3 weeks of editing later, we performed it in this theater. And as I said, what Pierre wanted happened pretty much the way he wanted. There were 5 performances. People sat in this shell and saw the puppet performance, and then they went and saw, there were 5 screenings of the film. And that's what happened on the night. That was the event. And then for 5 months, the film was on view with just the Darth Vader character, puppet hanging, upstairs in the gallery that's called the CERT Gallery, that was the Contemporary Gallery at Harvard. So those are the puppets, and that's the structure when it was done. And there's a lot of narrative in the production. I'm just going to say one more thing about the narrative. Just go back to this blob thing. There's the bird character, and then there are these vines that I wanted to show right there. That's it. These vines, which was another prop, a very complicated prop, that because it's a simple idea, but to get it to work, that's why I was so impressed with what we just looked at a minute ago, how brilliantly the details were done and how you don't necessarily have to use, stage level prop. But the idea here was that the landscape program would overtake the building, that it would become a kind of cancer. So there was some other metaphor at play. And the prop involved this vine that came up out of the building and sort of fell over it like, Little Shop of Horrors or something, and sort of moved around it. So that was part of the narrative. But that's all stuff that happened in the puppet play, but also in the film. And the puppeteers were rehearsed by Pierre. I was going to show you a little video clip, but do you want me to stop? Because I think it's only... Yeah. Can I just get to the end show, right? Wait, no. Oh, there. Okay. So you can see, this will probably just confirm your sense of him as a... can I get... You'll have to... Linda meaning the puppet, Linda. Puppeteer. So they worked with Pierre rehearsing.
Get this thing, yeah, perfect, and then now you look and you make the play,
Okay. Sorry. All right. Should I stop? Okay. So I didn't mean to take so long.
Leave it because John's going to use.
Oh, okay. All right. Let me just take my stuff. And maybe we could let John go, and then if there's any more questions, do you want to, and answer questions at the end? Sorry. Sorry about that.
And the subject is American Puppet Modernism, and it's about different aspects of performance with puppets and stuff from like the mid-19th century through today. And so what I wanted to think about is what it means to talk about puppets or think about puppets. And I wanted to thank Joe Zane and everybody here and for making this cool event. Okay, va bene. So what do we mean when we talk about puppets? Yes, we're talking about hand and rod-operated creatures with practicable mouths developed by Jim Henson in the 60s as a means of mass media entertainment, early childhood education, and advertising. And we also mean the other half of 20th century American puppetry, that strain initiated by bread and puppet theater director Peter Schumann's papier-mâché and scholastic sculptures as a means of making avant-garde and political performance. Henson's work connects both to the reassuring sense of puppetry as children's entertainment, a persistent theme in Europe and the United States since the 19th century, and to puppetry's utter effectiveness as propaganda, an application understood not only since the early days of public relations in the early 20th century, but also going back to the 17th century origins of that term, propaganda, when puppets and masks were essential to the propagation of the Christian faith. Schumann's work also connects to two traditions. One is the centrality of puppets to art and performance, which communicates the fundamental social, political, and religious tenets of a particular society, a function with remarkable consistency in Asian, African, European, and American cultures over the past few hundred centuries. The other tradition is the more recent effort by Western artists to activate the material world in order to make modern art and performance, an effort which particularly characterizes the early avant-garde, from symbolism to futurism, expressionism, Dada, constructivism, and the Bauhaus. Obviously, what I am proposing here is that the term puppet is much more than children's entertainment, but I'm also proposing that it is also much more than serious art for adults. The ideas I would like to explore right now are these. First, that to understand puppetry is to understand the nature of the material world in performance. And second, that the material world in performance is the dominant means by which we now communicate. Outrageous claims for the scope of puppetry. One of the most useful concepts for this subject is Frank Proscien's term performing objects, material images of humans, animals, or spirits that are created, displayed, or manipulated in narrative or dramatic performance. In other words, the stuff, junk, puppets, masks, detritus, machines, bones, and molded plastic things which people use to tell stories or represent ideas. In the familiar sense, such objects are puppets and masks of all sizes and forms, from cultures all over the world in all different eras, since every society has always had vibrant performing object traditions. But more than puppets and masks, we are thinking of sculptures and paintings used in performance, ritual objects manipulated in religious services, and signifying props essential for the administration of states. We are thinking of Plato's 3rd century BCE allegory of the cave, as Karen's show elucidated, through which, in order to explain the difference between the ideal and the real, he describes a performance combining projected light and the shadows of objects as they are cast on a wall. We are thinking of performing machines, such as those designed by Ibn al-Jazari in 13th century Mesopotamia, which is this one. We are thinking of the automatons of the 18th and 19th century, and we are thinking of the kinds of things the New York Times blogger Virginia Heffernan was wondering about in her response to the 2007 Super Bowl television ads. She wrote, "It's astounding to me, I'll say it again, how many car ads have absolutely no people, no passengers, engineers, proud auto workers, drivers in them. Many feature robots or hints of robotry. What's this about?" Yes, what is this about? I think it's about the fact that performance with objects has always been an important method of communication in every culture, but one to which we don't always pay attention. In contemporary United States culture, the objects being performed are as various as Avenue Q puppets, street demonstration flags and effigies, Al Gore performing a PowerPoint presentation about global warming, you know, the equivalent of this right now, beautiful machines moving through the desert at Burning Man, or images of beautiful machines moving through a landscape, as a Honda CDV projected on a plasma television screen during Super Bowl. To respond to Heffernan's specific question, I would say that in the context of the last 2 centuries, we need to understand the increasing frequency of a specific kind of performing object, the machine, and how machines in industrial and post-industrial life perform with us and for us, to the extent that most people's performance lives today are indeed focused on machines, computers, video screens, film screens, telephones, radios, cell phones, which transmit stories and ideas. These are all performing objects representing a unified field, and they now dominate our senses. How can we understand the play with objects as an integrated global performance tradition with a past, present, and future? And then I go on to talk about theories of text, body, and object. And I'm saying that the dominant means of understanding the nature of theater in the West has for many centuries been a dual articulation of the roles of actor and text, human being and word. The drama is considered to be a process whereby a writer puts together words which are then spoken by an actor on a stage, assisted by a director, costume designers, set designers, and so on. In the second half of the 20th century, a different sense of the nature of humans and words developed, with 2 branches of critical theory that focused on text and body as metaphors for understanding the nature of existence and performance. Jacques Derrida could see history and culture specifically as struggles about writing, or indeed all history and culture as writing. Differently, Judith Butler, following Simone de Beauvoir, saw the body as a commanding locus and metaphor, which could indeed be considered not only flesh and blood, but a historical situation. In order to better understand the nature of performance, scores of theorists over the past 2 decades have developed theoretical models based on concepts of the text or of the body, sometimes even in combination, as in Michel Foucault's sense of the body itself as an inscripted site, text and body together. However, metaphors of text and body cannot really come to terms with the third important factor of performance, the object, the thing, which is neither word nor flesh and ultimately cannot be understood as word or flesh. The basic problem with puppets and masks and machines and other forms of stuff is that the material world resists our human intrusion until we ourselves ultimately rejoin the material world when our lives cease. We can shape and transform the material world, and we can even imagine that world to be inhabited by spirits, but in the end, the different elements of the material world, wood, leather, glass, stone, sand, water, bone, plastic, and light, resist our attempts to dominate them, and the metaphors of text and body stop at the threshold of things. Performance with objects is not simply the realization of a dramatic script, nor the performance of language, although these might be parts of it, and neither is it entirely explainable as acting, dance, or any other performance of the body. It is humans coming to terms with the material world, a momentary alliance or bargain between humans and the stuff of, or literally stuff in performance. And then I get into diagrams, and I'm talking about the fact that, like in dance, the relationship is the dancer's body in space, and then the audience. So the relationship is bodies, we're looking at each other, I'm dancing, like that. Then Vysvolod Meyerhold, the great Russian director of the early 20th century, he talks about what he calls the theater of the straight line, where he talks about a relationship between the author who writes the text, the director who directs the text, the actor, and then the audience. So that in the performer-audience relationship, behind the performer are all these other people who are responsible for text and directing. So it's still this mutual regard. But object performance is different than all of those, because with object performance, we're dealing with material objects. And so the relationship is not one between these two groups, but my focus on this object
and your focus on this object, you know, if I'm doing it right and not making you focus on me. So that's a kind of a triadic relationship, and that's quite different from those other forms of performance, because my concentration and your concentration should be, oh, I see what's going on. It's a VU light. So my concentration and your concentration is focused on my ability to make the red light blink like that. So anyway, the performance triad is essentially different from acting or dance. Okay, so va bene. Then the implications are first, that performing object theater necessitates not only a focus but also an ontological shift from humans, as in the Meyerholt and dance models, to the world of inanimate materials. Humans are humbled before that world, and this humbling has implications for the ego of the performer, forcing us to consider even unconsciously a world in which humans are not of central importance. The unease of this kind of this kind of thinking invariably brings with it must be part of the reason why we like to imagine object performance as a process of bringing life to the dead objects. Wow, it's as if they're really alive, just like us, and why we are proud of our ability to bring life to those objects. Secondly, performing with objects requires us to recognize that when we play with them, we are simply animating the dead things for a little while before they come to rest again, and before we come to rest. And playing with the dead world is what this is about, which is ultimately sort of a magical kind of relationship, and has been, as players with objects have traditionally been seen as shamans, playing with the dead world and making it live. Playing with the dead world, we think, must open up communication with that world. And in a more modern version of that, Sigmund Freud talks about the uncanny by noting the work of Ernst Jentsch, who focused on doubts whether an apparently animate being is really alive, or conversely, whether a lifeless object might not be in fact animate. And this idea of the uncanny was characteristic of other late 19th century writers like E.T.A. Hoffmann, Edward Gordon Craig, who initiated an interest in objects, as well as from the previous century, Heinrich von Kleist, who stepped in, and all of these people stepped into weird territory when trying to figure out what objects do. Performing objects are automatically weird. They are uncanny from a rationalist perspective, or they are magical from an irrationalist perspective. The third thing is that the performing objects drift towards the uncanny and mysticism. The primitivism of shamanist performance is why in the 20th century such performance practices had to be tamed, first by totalitarian regimes in Europe, the Soviet Union and then Germany and Italy, and fascism, and then by the development of capitalist mass culture, so that the objects are separated from their traditional roles in ritual state performance and anti-authoritarian resistance in order to be recast as safe entertainment for children and socially productive education materials and propaganda techniques for public relations and advertising. A fourth implication is this odd thing about the necessity of letting the object determine action, which is to say, as Sherry Lewis once said, there's so much bad puppetry around because people simply decide that they're going to do a puppet and then try to force a character onto that puppet. And you can't force it. You have to sit in front of a mirror and let the puppet tell you what it wants to do. And many different puppeteers have variations on this idea. If you're working with objects, you can't just make it do what you want to do, but you have to find out what's good for the object, which is sort of the opposite of the central idea of a film like Being John Malkovich, where the puppeteer, played by John Cusack, is about control. But actually, puppeteering is not about control at all. It's about not being in control. Technology is puppet performance. When Stuart Brand wrote The Media Lab, Inventing the Future at MIT in 1987, he was attempting to explain how the MIT Media Laboratory was acting upon founder Nicholas Negroponte's conviction that, quote, something big and convergent is happening to the whole gamut of communications media, television, telephones, recordings, film, newspapers, magazine, books, and infesting and transforming them all, computers. In the first year of a Media Lab project called Vivarium, Jim Henson Associates helped graduate student Allison Druin create a soft, furry, over-life-size Muppet creature named Newbie, built with a lap and a computer screen in his belly. According to Brand, Newbie, quote, was designed to be an input device, an alternative to sensually impoverished keyboards, a warm place where kids can hug their tools and create their fantasies. This invention is in keeping with conceptions of 20th century American puppetry as children's entertainment, but what I would propose is that every single project of the Media Lab in those early years, holography, robotics, digital video, virtual reality, the development of computer graphics and desktop utilities. It's interesting to go back and look what they were doing because it's like, oh yeah, right. Computer-aided design, computer graphics, video conferencing, motion capture, and the internet in general was and is in fact a form of object performance along the lines I've outlined above. But where would these outrageous claims for the purview of puppet theater take us? What good are they? Well, I think that if we can understand what we mean when we talk about puppets, we can also understand what we mean when we talk about the performance of technology in today's societies. First of all, we could understand that machines are inherently performers, not only because of their performative power to actually do something, to manufacture, as some of them do, but because they also always perform ideas in a theatrical, aesthetic, or ritual sense. The weird concepts, death, the uncanny, and letting the object determine action, which I defined above as implications of object performance, are also the implications of machine performance. Secondly, I think such connections in our thinking might help us understand the function technology in our society is as not simply a phenomenon of the past last century and a half, as Siegfried Gideon puts it in Mechanization Takes Command, which is a book from the 40s, but as a cultural phenomenon with deep roots not only in the earliest examples of mechanics, but in the connected functions of objects as tools and ritual elements in the centuries beforehand. Let us consider the elephant water clock of the 12th century Mesopotamian engineer Ibn al-Jazari. Until recently, the significance of al-Jazari's groundbreaking innovations in hydraulics, pumps, crankshafts, calibration of orifices, wood lamination, static balancing of wheels, and metal casting had been neglected in the West to a large extent, I would say, because that construction looks to Westernize more like an amusement park installation than an object of social function. In other words, the puppet-like performance qualities of the elephant water clock, the bright colors, the pleasing display, and the animal and human characters brought to life, made the water clock seem trivial rather than functional, theatrical rather than functional. And yet, last November at the MIT Media Lab, Gunalan Nadarajan's talk on Islamic automation argued that al-Jazari's work was a leading exponent of Islamic automation, wherein automation is a manner of submission. Islamic automation, wherein automation is a manner of submission rather than the means of control that it has come to represent in contemporary culture, and an example of untoward programming, which involves deliberate and elaborate programming for untoward rather than predictable behavior in automated devices. I think the West misunderstood and dismissed the importance of Ibn al-Jazari's automata because of the obvious theatricality of his work, the extent to which the elephant water clock entertained as well as told time, the extent to which it was like a puppet show, in other words. But I think that if we can, look, I rubbed it and, okay, I caressed the tool. But I think that if we can better understand what puppets and performing objects do, we will better understand, oh, there it is, the larger history of the material world and performance, how it affected us in the past, and how it will affect us in the future. Thank you very much. So, yes?
What do you think about the relationship between kind of like, when you started with like Fred Puppet and Muppets, that's sort of the unnaturalism versus the sort of the predominant strain of naturalism and realism in American theater, sort of like the method acting kind of school that also permeates Hollywood. That at that moment, like, or just like post-war, you had this sort of great focus in American theater on realism, and then you have these two puppet theaters that are sort of about this theatricalness, this unrealism, this magic that's not realism.
Right. Well, first of all, I think if you look at the history of film and the history of television after World War II, when I look at it, I don't see it as dominated by realism, because if you look at horror movies or action films or cartoons or the most popular movies of all time are like Jurassic Park and Star Wars and The Lord of the Rings, and those are all total puppet movies. So there's something about puppets that like is good investment.
I guess what I mean is there's something about, like when we talk about the great actors, for example,
yeah.
Since post-war, we're talking about people who are some sort of masters of
right.
It's not exactly realism, but you know what I mean? Like we're talking about Scorsese's cast, you know, and it's sort of this extravagant realism, whatever you want to call it, but like De Niro and those guys, those guys were about sort of.
Well, I think like the medium that Scorsese uses, though, is an object medium, because it's about film. There's a great interview with Julie Andrews where she talked about working with Alfred Hitchcock, and she was working with Alfred Hitchcock, and Hitchcock, they were shooting, and he said, okay, look into the viewfinder of the camera, what do you see? And you know, she said, oh, it's the room, and he said, no, it's shapes and colors. And so Hitchcock's way of looking at composition of the image was all about shapes and colors, and I think that, you know, you're right. I think especially I presently teach in a theater department where all of the students are taught that the most dominant, you know, acting is the basis of all art, and realistic acting is the basis of all art. But in fact, you know, film is not. You're not looking at actors. You're looking at a projected image. I mean, that's the point I would try to get across. And directors think about it that way, like Hitchcock does, as the arrangement of light on a screen. So I think I understand what you're saying, maybe, about the dominance or the assumed dominance of realism and acting.
I guess you mean there's some sort of sense that that's the height of
kind
of theater in some way.
Right.
Not that it's exactly
right.
like you said, like there's this great
right.
and cherished like monster movies and horror films and sci-fi
right.
films and you know, and this musical theater doesn't engage in that. It is sort of more fanciful, but there's something I think in that moment where we still like judge that sort of realism, or what's considered realism, as being some sort of pinnacle of that kind of theater. Right. And these are almost in direct opposition to that.
Right.
I mean, I don't know that it's intent, you know, that relate exactly, but it's kind of coincidental.
Yeah, there's a degree to which how does he put it? It's this negative. The negative privilege of puppets is that nobody cares, so you can do what you want, you know. But you know, if you look at advertising on the television, it's continually based on puppets and objects. So like people who, and I think advertising is a very economical like if it doesn't function well, they're not going to do it, you know. You're going to lose the account. And so the fact that, as Heffernan points out for the Super Bowl ads, it's just the machine, it's just the beautiful machine, you know. Like how many ads have you seen it's about the beautiful machine, which is really goes back to constructivism, that it's totally functional. But I think you're right, the thinking is, oh, we live in a world where realism rules and it's all about actors and stuff. So it's, yeah.
position though really, I mean, it interests me because I think it makes a stronger case for what you're proposing in a way, because the example, I agree that there's this kind of residual conceit or belief that the true, that something that's direct, I mean, you could have taken cinema verite or some, you know, other examples of something that would be unmediated by the object. But in fact, the evidence is that we respond, even in method acting is such an exaggeration that it functions in the way.
I agree that method acting is an exaggeration. I don't dispute that, but we talk about it as realism.
No, but that, I think that's
But I think you're speaking from two different perspectives, one of the maker and one from the perspective of the audience.
But the
And the audience will never consider that we're looking at a projected image, and they'll never necessarily look at it the way Hitchcock does, and that's why he sublimated for you.
right, because you want to be duped. You want to imagine that you don't want to be duped.
Sorry?
You want to imagine that you know better what you're supposed to do. But I
Or you want to imagine that you believe what you want. Or you want to.
But that you believe it because you know.
But sort of, but I think also we're very sophisticated viewers of like computer-generated images, like in the Star Wars movies, or like what's the new Tarantino movie where there's a photo, the Pulp movie that's like a couple of films that are together, and there's one of the women has a gun attached to her leg, and then the photograph in the Boston Globe today, you can sort of see where it's been photoshopped out. The outline of her rear leg is photoshopped out, and the gun is placed in there because she really has two legs. So we're sophisticated viewers of digital imagery. You know, we know what's happening with Star Wars and why The Lord of the Rings is, you know, has the images that it does, or a movie like 300 about the Battle of Thermopylae or whatever it is. You know, we're sophisticated about that. So I mean, to a certain extent, we do know what's going on, I would say. Yes, sir.
I want to second what you said about a visual when you're talking about Hitchcock. I happened to be observing setting up for a movie recently that was here, they were shooting in Boston. And 99% of what they were doing, who the people were who were running around, the equipment, seemed to be all about the lighting. And one little percentage was when the actors showed up and got in front of the cameras. But I was more interested in when you mentioned some of the early projects at the Media Lab. It seems to me that there's an important distinction between the presence of puppets, the material presence of puppets before us, and any form of visual representation of them, as sophisticated as that can be, as object, as much as that can be representations of objects. There's still, for me, somehow, the important line of demarcation is the presence of the material object of the puppet and the way in which, by being present as a material object that may or may not be manipulated, it can have this character of animation. And for me, none of the visual stuff has that property. And I just wonder what you might have to say about
Well, I think for me the important thing is that, you know, as Karen's show showed, the Plato was familiar with shadow theater, and you know, it seems to me that the history of film goes back to the history of shadow theater. If you look at the early film in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, the work of Georges Méliès, you know, the history of film is the history of light projected on a screen. Whenever we're looking like this, we're looking at light projected on a screen, and this is pixelated, and it's a manuscript that's been scanned, and I mean, this is highly complex, what we're looking at right now, or what we're looking at. But we're searching, right? But it's the shadow theater is one of the oldest forms of performance, and I think sometimes when we think of film, it's like, well, it was invented in 19 whenever 11, and before that, so if we want to think about film, we have to start like in Mechanization Takes Command. It's all new, and I want to say, well, sort of, but also the dynamics of this are what Plato was talking about. They are dominant in other cultures too, like in Indian and Javanese and Chinese culture, shadow theater is really strong. So maybe there's something to learn from that. I mean, the fact that Ibn al-Jazari was from present-day Iraq, and that this is about Islamic technology, and that that maybe it's worthwhile looking at Islamic technology because it was done in the 12th century when the Europeans weren't doing anything. Just like Islamic mathematics, well, maybe their connections could be made that would be fruitful to think about in terms of mechanics, like this guy who talked last November. So I'm interested in making connections among these different forms of performance that deal with the material world. The thing with light as an object, I mean, I guess physically I'm not a physics person, but I mean, light is a material, right? So you can perform with light, and so it's different from this kind of object, but similar. Yes. Or
question about if what would you? The case you're making is so strong in a sense that it could extend to almost any kind of sort of triadic performance where we identify, where the performer and the viewer are both focused on an agent. What would you say isn't that, if you don't think?
Well, I'd say that's all. For me. I guess teaching in a theater program, I'm aware of the degree to which the people there are taught that it's all about the body, it's all about the voice, or in Stanislavski training, it's going inside the body, and props. A prop is not a puppet because a prop is always never the center of focus. But so when I look at objects in the vast, overarching way I'm looking at it, I think they're all related, and that maybe the way we think about them, the way they function, as mystical elements, some of the dynamics of their use, like letting you have to figure out what the object wants to do. You can't just make it do whatever you want it to do, but you have to do what it wants to do. Those extend across specific techniques, So yes, Muppets, yes, shadow figures, but also the water clock or digital projection, like what we have here, or this, beautiful, this, I'm saying, yeah, this is a puppet in a way, not to be stupid, but like the way this works, if we think about it, it might be useful to, because you have to do the right thing with it, like if you don't know what you're doing, you can't make it do what you want to do, and, oh, it just made a sound, didn't it? So, so it's more helpful to look at performance with this in terms of puppets than to look at it as, in terms of Stanislavski technique, I think. So I'm not sure if I answered your question.
You did say that the body, things that are directed to you answered it. Thank you.
I guess I can't help but notice the trombone sitting there and objects thing where musical instrument is an object that connects the audience to the performer in a way that I think puppets do too. It's maybe not about separating the performer from the audience, it's about connecting them to the object. I can't help but really think musical instruments demonstrate that in a really amazing way.
So you mean so that the instrument connects the, it's not that we're separated, but the instrument connects the performer and the audience? Yeah.
There's no connection without the instrument,
Right.
and that's an instrument, or that's an object that definitely demands technique or asks to be handled in a certain way.
Right.
So I guess the connection I make, it's more or less with the film is one way, but I think it's a lot easier to understand the power of that is completed.
Well, I think you're right that I would say in response that the way you're looking at it is actually much more Hamish than the way I'm looking at it, because it is about connection. You know, these objects connect people. It's not just that we're separated, but through the object we're connecting, I think. But, yeah, absolutely. Oh, this, yeah, I'm sorry.
Sometimes you see trends that sort of ripple out, and this multidisciplinary trend in theaters now to include dance and shadows and video and voice and structure versus randomness. This was not the case, even except very specific little topics like New York or San Francisco or all
Right.
But it's much more generalized now, and people are amazed at how powerful. Even something like last weekend was a tiny little new group, alias, and they were working with those elements, and it was just like you're saying, it was almost like the combination of a mystical experience where the emanation of the video echoes and almost reverbed and almost did visualize the sound ripples that we know come out and hit us in ways that originally might not be, quote, musical, but are absolutely appropriate. And that the actual sound makers did not sit in an orchestra pit. They moved around with objects of sometimes household usefulness. And there was innovation, but there you could also see the structures of the interplay between the people that were, so to speak, puppets, and the objects that were manipulated, and the original predetermined media that was carefully experimental, but blending it together. It was allowing people that were not at all art theater people, avant-garde, usually you have one person that say, and then you drag and when it's done with a more natural response to what the limitation of that materialism is, and your overall collaboration, it's absolutely powerful.
And I guess I would say that when I think like to understand the traditions of that is kind of cool too, because I think for some of us puppeteers, we would we'll read reviews of a puppet show, and like and it's as if it's a review of an opera where the reviewer says, I just saw this show, it's really amazing, it's about this guy Don Juan, and you're not going to believe this, but they sang instead of talking. I know it sounds crazy, but they sang and there was dance, and believe it or not, it actually worked. It's so amazing that you could do this, but apparently someone thought of doing this, and they're doing. And with puppets, like when The Lion King came out, it's like it's so amazing. Like, my God, actually, in the turn of the century, 100 years ago, on Broadway theaters, they were doing similar stuff. But the fact that it disappeared to be rediscovered so that it becomes a fresh discovery is sort of interesting. My God, who would have thought that anybody in the world could have done The Lion King with, instead of actors, they're using masks and puppets? The fact that we don't know the history sort of seems to me like it holds us back a little bit, or, well, okay, good, but if we had a sense of that as a continuing system, a continuing tradition, then we'd be more sophisticated and know how to understand things and what might be possible in the future. Thank you very much.